Today I'm going to talk a little bit about our flagship drug, which is HUMIRA, how we discovered it, and how artificial intelligence played in the role of getting it to market. And also I'm going to talk about some of the technologies and what we're using to try to find new treatments for COVID. So please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to answer it at the end. So AbbVie used to be part of Abbott Labs. It was one of, I think, the largest company in Illinois. They split into two companies in 2014 just because the company was getting too large, and AbbVie does all the drug development now, and Abbott Labs does all medical devices. Headquarters is in the city of North Chicago. It's about 20 miles north of Chicago proper, and we have research centers around the globe. And we have several functional groups. Immunology is our biggest. We work on many immune diseases, so that has set us up nice to work on COVID. And also we have departments in virology, neurology, oncology. And we have a fifth department where if you are retired and you can volunteer to work for tropical diseases, because these are less profitable, but are equally as important, and many people still like to do what they can to help cure disease even after they retire. So that's our fifth department. So I work in a department called the Raiders, kind of a funny name. It stands for the Rapid AI Developers, for Artificial Intelligence Developers. And we consist of many data scientists, and all of us in the Raiders have a different expertise. And we're kind of consultants within the company and work in different functional areas. I specifically work within the clinical trials, but we have people in departments such as finance, research, the library, and all of us try to use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotic process automation to make drug development more efficient and bring cures to people more quickly. So ultimately, pharmaceuticals is about the patient, and ultimately we want to bring new cures to market faster. So what are we doing? AbbVie's goal is to produce a constant stream of innovative medicine, and AI is really on the forefront of technology. So we try to incorporate it any place we can that we can make processes more efficient. Within there's a larger data solutions team. This is made of about 100 data scientists, where we try to look through data and use that information as much as possible to glean the maximum amount of what we'd say wisdom out of globs of data. And within there, we have the Raiders that are just dedicated to artificial intelligence, and we say we want to take the robots out of human beings. And what I mean by that is, a lot of us in the lab, if you work in a lab or in day-to-day life, have to do processes that are very repetitive. And it would be far easier to be able to have a robot, or what we call a bot, which is just kind of a robot that exists only in the computer, that can do several processes very efficiently and do it the same over and over. So instead of paying someone to do a very tedious task, we can write these bots that can do it automatically, and this can speed up drug development quite a bit. And for myself, why I find my field very interesting and why I've pursued it was, I think understanding how we can create artificial intelligences in the computer also teaches us quite a bit about ourselves, how our cognition works. Ultimately, we could think maybe neural nets can be kind of a window into how humans think as well, and can teach us about ourselves. So how do we do it? So the Raiders, we exist kind of as a Uber consulting organization within the company. AbbVie's enormous. We have about 20,000 employees worldwide. Actually, we did, and we just merged with Allergan, so we're almost double in size to about 40,000 people. And we have Raiders that are embedded in all these different departments: research, development, health outcomes, regulatory, image analysis, library, and finance. So there's lots of places that artificial intelligence can add value to the company. And specifically, my department is called Pharma Dev, and within that are the clinical studies. So these are potential questions that artificial intelligence can help you out with. How can you take these mind-numbing tasks out of drug development? For example, if you're just looking through doctor's notes all day to make sure they sign the right form, instead of having someone do this day after day, can we have a computer do it for us? Can we increase the velocity where someone has an idea? Is this drug actually going to work to COVID to FDA approval? Normally this takes almost a decade, but because this pandemic is affecting everyone, we're trying to do it as fast as possible, and the government's working with us to do that as well. Also, we'd like to decrease the cost of drugs for patients. So the more efficient we can make our research and development, the better it is for all of us. Also, every drug, even the most benign drug like Tylenol, has adverse events, especially cancer drugs. So we want to minimize any adverse effects, side effects. So, people have the best experience taking the drug. And also, drugs work differently on different people. They may work different across age groups, gender, race. So we want to know which patients respond best. We also want to know what dosage is optimal for different people. And what's especially pertinent this year, it's affected us all, is the COVID pandemic. Is there a way to actually stop the infection, or for someone that is infected, can we stop people from being admitted to the ICU, or lower the mortality rate through different drugs? And I'll talk about that in more detail. So where do we start? I started about 2 years ago when the Raiders started. We had everyone brainstorm different problems that they had in their day-to-day life in the clinical trials to say, I think artificial intelligence can help me with this process because it's really taking me a long amount of time, or we have to spend so much money doing this one process. So we take all of these ideas and we create a little matrix out of them, where here on the y-axis we have how much value we give to the business, which we quantify by how many dollars are returned per hour to the company if we implement an artificial intelligence process. Also, on the x-axis we have how complex is the idea. So you could think some really wild ideas like language translation is extremely complex, also very important because we're a global company. So that would go up in quadrant 2, that has high complexity, high business value. But what I'm going to talk about today is something that's slightly less complex, but also has enormous business value, is how do we actually discover a new drug by finding what target in the body would actually help alleviate disease. So I'm going to start with something we have a lot of experience with, and then go to what we're doing with COVID and our progress there. So HUMIRA is a disease. It's a drug that is used to treat rheumatoid arthritis. It's been our flagship drug. It makes up a bulk of our profit, and it has been a great success story in alleviating suffering from rheumatoid arthritis. So essentially, just to get to the science behind this, most diseases are caused by a protein in the body that becomes overactive, and it causes some process in the body to happen too much. So in the case of rheumatoid arthritis, you have pain in your joints, and that's caused by inflammation. And this is believed to be caused by an overactivity of a protein called tumor necrosis factor, or TNF. And TNF is a protein that hits the TNF receptor, and then this causes the inflammation of your joints that causes a lot of pain. So the question is, how can we block this overactive signal? And traditionally, There are different ways of targeting diseases in the body. So for example, in cancer, we've all heard of chemotherapy or radiation. And these are fantastic at killing cancer, but they also have an enormous amount of adverse effects because they kill all dividing cells. So people lose their hair, also have problems with their immune system because all the hair cells and immune cells divide all the time along with cancer. So by targeting proteins, we call it targeted therapy. We hope to reduce the adverse events while maximizing the efficacy of the drug. So some drugs that we have out that you may have heard of, Orlissa is for endometriosis, and it hits the gonadotropin protein. Marinol was a synthetic form of THC. We saw that it stimulates the cannabinoid receptor. Duodopa is a drug that we sell for Parkinson's disease, and it hits the dopamine receptor in the brain. And HUMIRA, as I said before, hits the TNF receptor. So you could kind of think most of AI in this field is a big optimization problem where you have drugs that connect to proteins and proteins connect to diseases. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to find the right drug for the right protein that can cure the disease that you care about. So how do we find the right therapy? So for example, with TNF, TNF is represented here as a trimer. It's a protein that forms a complex with two others, TNF molecules, to form this little triangle. And what HUMIRA does is it binds to the, in 3 places to TNF. And it blocks it from hitting the receptor, so the TNF signaling never goes through and the inflammation doesn't occur. And this was extremely effective, but how did we actually discover it? There's 2 different ways that drugs traditionally have been discovered. One, you could start with the compound. So the drug that is sold more than any other drug worldwide is aspirin. And this was known by indigenous Americans from willow bark, was known to relieve pain. And it wasn't until the 20th century that they discovered that the compound within willow bark was called salicylic acid, and this blocked a protein called COX-1-2. And eventually they modified the protein a little bit, they modified the drug that came from the willow bark to create acetylsalicylic acid that sold as aspirin. And now we know what the target is, and we know that aspirin is very effective at reducing pain and inflammation. A second way that we can form drugs is we can actually do a lot of experiments in the lab to see what protein we think has a high correlation with a certain disease. So it was discovered that tumor necrosis factor was highly correlated with how severe people's rheumatoid arthritis symptoms were. So we had a hypothesis that if we could discover an antibody, which essentially binds to a protein in our body and neutralizes it, if we could find one that we could inject in the body, then we could prevent the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis. So with this particular TNF protein, we did a screen where what was called phage display. I won't go too much into detail, but we caused a virus to produce a number of variations of a protein until we found one that bound really well to TNF. And then we injected this into rabbits so the rabbits could produce this particular antibody. And eventually we're able to do it outside of animals and do it in the lab. And we saw this as HUMIRA. Since then, HUMIRA has been found to be effective in many, many diseases. Pretty much all that are related to having an overactive immune system. So you probably all of us know someone with Crohn's disease or spondylitis or psoriasis, and HUMIRA has been extremely effective at, it just kind of dampens the immune system just enough so you know, it's not going to kill your immune system, but it's going to stop it from having these terrible effects where it's attacking the body. So how do we find the next HUMIRA? essentially, as time goes on, less low-hanging fruit exists. So it gets a little harder and harder to find out what the next drug will be. So we have to turn to kind of more fancy mathematics and ultimately to artificial intelligence to comb through all of this big data that we're able to accumulate. After the Human Genome Project was completed in the year 2000, we're now able to sequence a genome for less than $100. So we're able to get tremendous amount of information very quickly that is too much information for any one human to look at and say, oh, this gene would be a good target and we need this drug. So we turn to artificial intelligence to help us. So essentially we want to find the target and then we want to find a compound and we cure the disease. One problem is there's about 100,000 different targets in the human body. And from here, there's possibly 100 trillion different drugs in the world. Not drugs that people take, but potential molecules that have been constructed by chemists in various laboratories. So the search space is enormous. So the question is, we really need AI to be able to comb through this tremendous search space and find what we're looking for. So to get into mathematics, supervised machine learning, which is a subset of artificial intelligence, is essentially trying to solve a problem of a predicted response. So the predicted response here would be, let's say, does someone have severe COVID symptoms or mild COVID symptoms? So it can give them a 1 for severe and 0 for mild. And then we could think of different predictors that could predict how this particular patient would have different symptoms should they acquire COVID-19, the virus. So to do this, it will be some function of different variables we call explanatory variables that predict the target responses. So certain questions that we'd want to answer is a particular target upregulated in diseased patients? Is it expressed in diseased tissue, which would be the lungs for COVID? We can also comb through academic papers and see what different universities have published on, many universities have published on Google Scholar and PubMed, different targets that they think are correlated, and we want to be able to comb through those very quickly. And we can answer, does the target interact with the known disease targets? Also, can the drug actually reach the drug target? So what we could do is we can use different algorithms to take all this data that we can comb from different data sources and then use it to make a prediction on things we haven't tested yet. So for example, for COVID, we know we have different hypotheses on what targets may help the disease. We found in other viral diseases such as HIV or Hep C, actually targeting the viral protease prevents the disease spread, and this has been very effective. So we can, using machine learning, kind of find a probability that we think that targeting this particular protein would be effective at treating the symptoms of COVID. So viral protease, if we run through this particular algorithm, has a 95% chance of being effective. BCL2 is an apoptotic protein, BTK is another protein involved in the immune system. ACE2 is known to be where COVID actually enters the body. But we think we can't actually target that particular protein because it's involved in blood pressure and may have too many adverse events to be actually a good drug target. And the second problem we'd want to ask is, can we actually make a molecule that is going to stick to that target and work? And we do the same machine learning problem where we find a number of explanatory variables. For example, are there known molecules that bind to the target? Is the protein expressed in the cell? Do similar targets have known compounds? And do we know the actual structure of that protein? Given this, we can kind of have the probability that we can find a drug that will bind to that. So the viral protease, we can say these are just made up numbers, by the way. The viral protease, we could say, has a 50% chance of having a drug that can bind to it. we already have drugs to these other proteins, so maybe we can repurpose it and find a cure more quickly because it's already FDA approved for another indication. So to get more into the nitty gritty, essentially in machine learning, we're trying to solve for two response variables here. So target quality, is hitting this target actually going to stop COVID from having a large effect on the patient? And druggability is a question, can we make a drug to that target? And in order to do that, sometimes we scrape the web for data, for example, from the World Health Organization. We buy data from different places, from PubMed or like Elsevier. And we have internal data from our own scientists that are able to, do their internal screens. And we can use different algorithms to predict each of these responses from the explanatory variables. So one of the most used algorithms in machine learning is called random forest. Another one is called boosted trees, or XGBoost. Support vector machines and neural networks. These are by far the four most used algorithms that I use in my research in order to answer many questions in clinical trials. And one theorem we have is there's no free lunch. And essentially that means no algorithm is always going to be the best. There's always going to be some trade-offs in what you use. So for example, an ideal algorithm, we'd want to be able to get us an answer very quickly. We'd want it to be very simple without a lot of parameters to tune. We'd want to understand what the algorithm is actually telling us. For example, what variable is important for predicting the response. And also we want a highly accurate model. So often what we do is we kind of start from the left-hand side here. Random forest is very simple to implement, also accurate, but if we want to kind of have a better answer that's a little more complicated, we can use this other algorithm called XGBoost. We can go to support vector machines. And neural nets are really usually the best algorithm in any case, but they can be quite complicated and take a long time to tune. So we don't always necessarily have to jump right to neural nets, but it's a fantastic place of research that as computational power increases, we can go more and more towards neural nets. And consensus models mean that we run a number of algorithms and then average it out. So for example, with the COVID problem, this is actual data using XGBoost, where these are different, each circle is a different protein in the body. And on the y-axis here, we have target quality, is how well we think this will actually stop symptoms of COVID. And on the x-axis here, we have druggability, is how well we think we can make a drug to it. So ultimately, we'd want to start way up here in the upper right corner to say, this is low-hanging fruit, is that we could easily make a drug to it. Maybe we already have a drug that hits this protein and we think it will work. So we'd want to start here so we can maximize our probability that if we do start testing on humans, that it's going to work and it's going to be approved by the FDA. And I'd like to take a step back a little bit and say a lot of data scientists' job is not as fun as just making neural nets and trying to create new algorithms. A lot of times you're just trying to clean the data, because a big problem in all of data science is there's different words for the same thing. So there's a lot of data scientists' job is cleaning data, actually pulling down the data and using it in a format that we can feed into the algorithm. And this is what we call robotic process automation, or RPA. And this is kind of the simplest form of AI. Is if there's a certain task, for example, trying to look through documentation and seeing if a protein is mentioned and can we standardize the name of that protein to a certain convention where we can match databases up. And here's where we've done a lot of work with UIUC students at the Innovation Center. We have a large center down there, and many students helped make these bots And all of these were used for different purposes, where we had AbbVie employees spending a lot of time doing very tedious tasks, and the students were able to create these bots that were able to do the tasks automatically. And some of these bots saved the company up to $50 million. So this is a tremendous return on investment if we can use artificial intelligence, and even the simplest form of artificial intelligence was just robotic process automation, to just run these processes over and over in a very automated way. And we use different programs to create these bots, but our big one that we use at the Innovation Center is called Blue Prism. And if anyone's used a macro in Excel, essentially Blue Prism is what we call a macro on steroids. It's just able to do any process that someone does on a computer. For example, clicking a link on Chrome, downloading something, taking that information, putting it in a database. It could do something also like looking at forms, pulling out data from handwritten forms, reading tax returns, any of these things Blue Prism can do, and do well. So one bot that was very effective was we wanted to look through all of the literature on COVID and find any time that the word TNF was mentioned. So we can create this bot that goes to PubMed, opens up all the documents, reads it, pulls out any term that may have a synonym that is TNF. MarkLogic is our kind of library that's able to look at different vocabularies and still pull out our preferred term, which here would be TNF, and then replace it in the document. So therefore, now we have a bunch of papers that were put out by different academics from all around the world, and we're able to use standardized terms, and that way we're able to actually feed it in our algorithm and say, you know, is TNF or is EGFR or ERB2 going to be a good target to prevent COVID symptoms? Okay, now I'll get into a little nitty gritty of how we actually interface with the different users. So as a data scientist, there's kind of three things that you need to know. One is computer programming, one is the actual machine learning, and the third part is, you know, some expertise in a certain field. So for me, it's the clinical studies, and I mostly program in Python and SQL, and machine learning, I mainly stick around the random forest, XGBoost, and neural nets. So how we would actually go about starting a problem is we'd want to train a model. So for example, if we want to solve what's the best target that would prevent COVID mortality, we would start by training a model. And we could do this on cloud platforms. There's three that I know of. They're definitely the biggest in the country. AWS is what I use mostly. Microsoft has a cloud platform called Azure, and Google has a cloud platform called GCP. And some of you may recognize this building in the lower left. For very large problems where we need complex neural nets, or places where data may be, you know, trillions of rows of data. For example, we're actually trying to simulate the target binding to the protein. You know, we have variables in X, Y, Z over time, so this is like a 5-dimensional problem. Sometimes we'll use blue waters, and we will rent time down in Champaign-Urbana to solve these neural net problems, to optimize the neural net and give us answers back. So AbbVie and UIUC have a very symbiotic relationship. So to solve this problem of actually creating the, what we'd want to do is, normally I'd create a web app. So we want to give the decision-making power to the scientists themselves. So not to the data scientists, but to the COVID researchers. But we want to empower them as much as possible. So often what we'll do is we'll create an app as a web application so that they can go in and specify what problem they want, and then it can give them the answer in a very simple and accurate way. So to create this app, often we take public or private data, and to do this, I often use SQL from relational databases, but sometimes we have other databases, for example, triple databases where we use the Sparkle query language. And then we need to clean the data after that. This takes, unfortunately, a very long time sometimes. We use something like KNIME or Pipeline Pilot or Blue Prism in order to standardize this data. And then we will, on one of the servers, such as Blue Waters or on an AWS box, an EC2 instance, we'll create a Python program that will create a model. And the Python packages I use by far the most are Pandas, scikit-learn, TensorFlow, and PyTorch. Also, AWS has kind of a homebrew machine learning that is like Python that's called SageMaker, where you can just create your algorithm directly on the cloud and run it. And then we expose these trained models as API. So when we create an application, we could hit these models on the server and then it could send back an answer. So this is where the data scientist lives, and we want to do as much of this, in the background so the scientists themselves can, look at this web application and get the answer that they're looking for. So for example, the biologist or chemist would be looking at the front end instead of the server end, and they may enter a number of genes that they have a hypothesis would work well for preventing COVID symptoms. And then it would access this API that exists on the cloud. And we may expose this using the Flask package or API gateway in AWS. And then on the web page, they can visualize the network of how these different drugs interact with the targets. This web application can also rank order how we think each of these targets would work, how well we think these drugs will bind, given all of the information we could scrape. Or they could just look at a matrix like I showed you before and say, the one with the highest probability of working, we really want to start there, because that way we can get to the end quickest with the least amount of money and trouble. And I just want to, emphasize ultimately what we're trying to do in the pharma company is bring cures to patients as fast as possible. And COVID's really brought it home as, we don't have the luxury of a decade now to find a perfect drug. So we want to use machine learning and all of the data possible to bring out a drug as soon as possible, so we can, lower the mortality or the infection rate as much as possible and return to normal life as we can. So I would like to thank all of the admin who have helped me in this different project, and the Raiders team, as I said, is my specific team that works in AI, part of data solutions. The pharma dev group is the one that designs the clinical studies, and information research is the larger group that works on all of the information infrastructure in AbbVie, and AbbVie itself has been a great help and a great place to work for. And I'd like to also say that we work very closely with UIUC students. So if anyone is interested in following up, if there's any job opportunities, we do have a number of summer internships. We have some internships where we work on undergrad students that help us, especially with the RPA making bots or sometimes more complicated machine learning or artificial intelligence. And we're also growing quite quickly as a company and looking for full-time employees also. Data science and artificial intelligence in data science especially is a new field, so it's very hard to find applicants. So UIUC is a fantastic school, so we know there are many people out there who have the skills to do this, and feel free to email me if you have any questions about different opportunities. And now I'll go to questions. And that's my little bot avatar.
Real quick, Jazz, real quick before we go into questions, I just have a quick announcement. First of all, thank you, Mark. I really enjoyed the talk. I know I personally learned a lot. So thank you for coming and thank you for giving this talk. As a thank you to our attendees, we will be posting, or I will be posting a link in the chat as well as a code. And there are 5 $20 gift cards for Grubhub to give away to you guys. So please make sure to complete this within the next 5 minutes, because I'll only be leaving the form open for those 5 minutes. I will now give it over to Jazz to handle the Q&A section.
Hi, Mark. Thank you again. That was a very interesting presentation. So let's begin with the first question. It's, what is robotic process automation and how is it different from AI?
So artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotic process automation are words that are often used interchangeably, but they're slightly different. Artificial intelligence very broadly means anything that computers are traditionally not very good at, that humans are better at. So for example, image recognition would fall in artificial intelligence. Predicting what movie you're going to watch in Netflix is artificial intelligence. Machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence where you're trying to quantitatively solve an optimization problem of some sort. So if you're trying to see what drugs work or don't work, and you have a very defined output, you'd call that machine learning. Robotic process automation is a simpler form of artificial intelligence where you're not necessarily optimizing or solving a problem. What you're doing is you're automating a repetitive task. So say for a certain class, what you have to do is go to Google, Google this term, copy a bunch of things into Excel, calculate a sum, and then paste it into a document. What RPA can do is do all those clicks on your computer. You just say, run the bot, and then it would open the browser for you, take the data, clean it, do all the cutting and pasting, and give you an output. So it's very useful, but it's not actually true artificial intelligence where you're trying to solve a problem. It is just automating in a very automated and quick and efficient way, tedious process.
Awesome. Our next question is, do prediction functions account for target predictions that might be overlooked?
Yes, a big problem in science is confirmation bias. Is often everyone will have their favorite protein and they'll become an expert in it. PhDs are very focused, so they may know very much about a certain pathway. So for example, someone may know a huge amount about this particular TNF pathway, but may know less about other targets, and it may bias them to only looking in one spot. So I think machine learning and artificial intelligence does help unbias humans by, presumably artificial intelligence doesn't have a certain expertise. It's just looking at the data in a very unbiased way. So it can think about something that maybe your mind would have never thought about, is what if instead of hitting the immune system for COVID, we hit something totally unexpected? So would vitamin D, for example, has been found by scientists to be very effective in lowering COVID rates. So it could perhaps pull out something like this that you necessarily wouldn't be intuitive. So I think artificial intelligence is very good at grasping non-intuitive conclusions.
Our next question is, how do you work in improving the interpretability of DNNs?
So that one's a really tough question. Neural nets, as I showed you, there's the trade-off in all forms of machine learning algorithms. So for example, like regression is very interpretable. You can see that this particular variable has this amount of weight, so it matters a great deal. This one has a little weight, so it has less, may matter less. And when you're doing a neural net, you may have many layers. They may have many connections. Sometimes you have recurrent neural nets that feed back on each other, and you can get into all types of complicated architectures where you have inception networks that are like neural nets in neural nets. And the interpretability problem is still out there as a very tough problem to solve. And sometimes we try to skip over it altogether and be like, it works, so why think about it? I'd say one way to actually figure out how it's working is you'd go into the neural net and you can randomly shut off half of the nodes and see how well it works, and then retrain it. And then you can randomly do this. And we think this is kind of how the brain works with brain waves, is that it's randomly going through and subsampling different nodes, so that we're always able to get slightly different neural nets, and it allows us to have more creative ideas. And so I'd say there's no good way. This is a field of a lot of research, but one way of doing it is trying to limit the size of the neural net and seeing how far you can limit it for it to still work. And if you can do that repeatedly, you can kind of try to figure out what are the actual variables that are causing the greatest effect in your target that you're looking at. So you can look at a factor, for example, this protein, and see that when you've squeezed your neural nets into just a subset of nodes that it still works, you can kind of conclude that this is a very important factor, and maybe convey that to the biologist and the chemist to say, you know, we think that our algorithm is working because of this. Can you use your scientific expertise to work with us to try to make this neural net better?
Awesome. Our next question is, what inspired you to join a role where you'll work in the intersection of data science / AI and pharmaceuticals?
That's a very good question. As an undergrad, I was a chemical engineer. So I have always liked chemistry, and you know, I think pharmaceuticals is more interesting to me because I know the human factor is very close. Whereas, you know, working in my first job was in an oil refinery, and that was very interesting scientifically, but didn't necessarily help, you know, humans directly. So I always like the clinical aspect is, you know, actually seeing the patients and seeing how it helps them. So that has always been an interest of mine. Chemical engineering is very math heavy, so that eventually led me to my PhD, where I worked on genomics and systems biology. And those just, as time went on, they involve such big data sets that you kind of have to learn artificial intelligence, and you have to learn Python, or your PhD would take decades because the data sets are just so enormous. Like, just to save yourself from going crazy, like, it helps to learn Python because it can do a lot of the work you need more quickly and form these conclusions. So naturally I gravitated towards, wow, this could help me, you know, finish my thesis faster. And then after I graduated, AbbVie was a quickly growing company. They had just branched off of Abbott. So it was a very good fit, and I've enjoyed working there quite a bit. So I kind of took the chemical aspect and the genomic aspect, and what I learned kind of on the side in big data to, you know, take this particular position of, you know, using AI in clinical studies. I think every data scientist comes from kind of a circuitous path, because there aren't, to my knowledge, a lot of colleges that have an actual data science major or artificial intelligence major. I know Northwestern has a data science master's program, but I do hope more schools do add those programs, because it would help people more directly feed into the field, instead of most of us raters that came in through some other route.
Our next question is, how do you think AI will transform how we perform clinical trials? And to what extent do you think AI might be able to accelerate clinical trials?
So very specific problems that AI can help with is knowing how fast a clinical trial will enroll. So for a phase 1 trial, we may have 20 patients. Phase 1 is just to see if the drug is safe. So we start with a very small subset, very controlled. Phase 2, we may have 200 patients. In phase 3, we may have 5,000 patients. So it's very important for us to predict how long it will take around the world to get this many patients that are willing and able to join the clinical trial and help this drug come to market. And there may be a lot of different factors that could predict it. So for example, in a country that has different types of health insurance, someone may be more likely to join a clinical trial. Someone may be more likely to join if they're closer to a research hospital. So people that are very close to the Mayo Clinic may be more likely to join. So we could feed all these variables into an algorithm and say, we think it will take 4 months to enroll this COVID trial, and it will take 2 months to run. So that is probably the most return on investment, is predicting the enrollment rate. We can also try to predict the dropout rate, and we can help shipping. Shipping is actually a very difficult optimization problem because every drug has an expiration date and is very expensive to produce in the clinical stage. So we want to make sure that we're shipping to the different clinical sites around the world in a way that they're always going to have some for the patient and it's not going to expire. So those are 3 problems where we're actively using artificial intelligence. And I'd say the new one, the bleeding edge one, is we're trying to incorporate wearables into the clinic. So we're trying to give patients that are on trial Apple Watches, and it can record things such as blood pressure, heart rate, how well they sleep. And we can use that data to make sure that the drug is safe and that it's working. So all of this, interpreting the data that's coming from the Apple Watches, does require a data scientist to go in there and create a model and say, this output from the Apple Watch tells us that it's working, or may have something that we need to look at closer.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you ensure information about your training data can't be leaked?
Information about, I'm not sure I understood exactly what this question means, but I'll interpret this as like any proprietary data that may be under the umbrella of HIPAA, which is, the United States is very, has a lot of laws to make sure that none of your personal health data gets out because, it's private and we don't want anyone to see it except people we give permission to. So in this case, any data that's HIPAA compliant, we have to do lots of internal audits to make sure that it's impossible for any of this data to be accessed from outside. Essentially what we do is we have what we call the Great Firewall that just goes around AbbVie. So when I log in my computer at home, I'm working remotely until the pandemic's over. I have to remote desktop through the firewall and do all my work in there. And any transfer of information between the firewall and outside will be monitored. And this is especially difficult when we really got into cloud computing is, we have to leave the firewall in order to access AWS servers. So we work very closely with Amazon to make sure that we audit every step in the trail to make sure that it's impossible for any health information to be seen by anyone that doesn't have authorization. And we also try to use things like the blockchain to, have 100% transparency. And in the blockchain, you can't alter anything. That's the power of something like the blockchain. So we can lock these databases down. So should anything strange go on, we can go back and know exactly what happened when and try to, patch any holes that we think may potentially be a problem in the future. And, this is something I don't deal with specifically, as we have a whole security team with many people that try to, they will build the servers for us in a secure way. And they work with the data scientists very closely, and the data managers, and the scientists too, to make sure that data security is paramount.
Thank you, Mark. Our next question is, I'm wondering how much of AI development in the pharmaceutical industry is implemented towards maximizing profit at the expense of patient, like price inflation. If some AI development is utilized for these practices, how do you leverage this?
So how pharmaceuticals are actually priced is a very complicated problem that I don't specifically deal with because I'm just in the clinical trials. But what people need to keep in mind is the number of drugs that we try, maybe in the tens of thousands. And out of these, for example, in the lab, we may have 100,000 compounds that we think may work on COVID. And as we run tox studies on animals, this may whittle down. As we run our phase 1 trial, these may whittle down. And in the end, we may only have 0 or 1 drug that actually works out of these 100,000. So a lot of money is necessary for all of these failed clinical trials in order to have 1 or 2 that works. And that's a lot of times why drugs do look on the surface very expensive. So I would say ultimately, getting the drug out quicker in a more efficient manner helps both AbbVie as a company and the patient. So we hope that it's kind of a win-win situation, is that the better research we can do, less clinical trials that we can do with less invasive procedures, will make AbbVie more profitable, and will also bring the drug to the patient quicker with less side effects and more efficacy. So we hope that there doesn't have to be a trade-off, is that what is good for the patient is also good for the company.
Our next question is, what percentage of data science would you say is web scraping and SQL stuff, and what percentage is more of machine learning?
I would say, honestly, for me, I would do maybe 5% actual making the algorithm work, maybe 10% front-end development, 10% server-side programming, and maybe about 30% trying to get the data and clean it. So ideally, I'd focus, all on the cool stuff, which is making the neural net. But in reality, I'd say, a quarter to half my job is making sure that the data is correct, clean, and stored properly.
Thank you. The next question is, what's the most difficult part of cleaning data in your work?
The most difficult problem, I would say, often with these gene names, they can actually spell other English words or foreign words. So there could be a gene that's called, there actually is a gene called MARC1. So if you're scraping the web for any mention of MARC1, you could find my name instead of the actual gene. So we have a huge problem with having artificial intelligence look at the context and say, does the SNAP protein, is this paper actually talking about the SNAP protein, or is it talking about snapping your fingers? So that's a huge problem, is how do we draw context as we're scraping the web for as much information as we can, so we're not pulling in completely spurious information. And just a very specific problem is when you put genes in Excel, Excel will automatically turn some of the genes into dates, like OCT8 is a gene, and you put it into Excel, and then it's impossible to turn it off, but automatically turn it into a date. And there's a number of genes that do that. So it's little things like that that can just drive you nuts. Like when you really want to get to, come on, I want to go to Blue Waters and make this like 10-layer neural net, and you're stuck with an Excel spreadsheet that you can't feed it in because it has date fields and has data pulled in from sociology papers. So that's one specific problem I do deal with all the time.
Another question is, what career advice do you have for someone that may want to follow a similar path as you and work with technology in the pharmaceutical industry?
I think creating a relationship with a pharmaceutical company early would help you quite a bit. I did my internship as an undergrad with BP Amico. So, you know, academics can get you so far, but you really have to like actually, you know, be in the actual experience of trying to solve a problem before it will stick. I mean, I'm sure all of you out there have the experience of like, you know, for example, if you want to learn foreign language, you can read it all you want, and it never really sticks until you go to a country and speak it. In the same way, if you wanted to be a data scientist in artificial intelligence, you know, starting at the Innovation Center and working, you know, just making RPA bots or whatever with EVI can, you know, start to open your mind to what problems, what technologies that a company such as EVI is using. And then in your spare time, you can go to Coursera or, you know, take classes at UIUC that would help you learn Python or TensorFlow or these specific problems. And then when you do graduate, you'd be very well situated by having a lot of connections in the field, as well as, you know, knowing very specifically the different types of problems. And that'll really help you in the interview by being able to speak the language as well. Is that every industry has slightly different jargon, and just you're never going to learn it unless you're around other people that speak that jargon. So starting early with an internship will help quite a bit. So if you want to be an AI in finance, you know, interning with the Board of Trade will really, really get you far. Or, you know, if you want to go into optimizing for finding artificial alternative energy sources is a big interest of mine too. You know, you can find an internship with BP like I did, or in pharmaceuticals, AI, Eli Lilly is close, Baxter is in North Chicago as well, Tempus is downtown Chicago, AbbVie. These are all really excellent pharmaceutical companies. So, you know, anywhere you could get your foot in the door, just doing something very small will get you far into getting, you know, your ultimate career that you're looking for.
Awesome. Mark, so it is 5 p.m., but would you have time for 1 to 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay, so our next question is, seeing how much of an interdisciplinary field your work is in, what do you think is the most important branch, AI, data science, or biology/chemistry? Or are they all more or less equal?
So I think clinical studies is not that complicated because it's very human, so you don't need to understand a great deal of science. Like you're trying to enroll people, you're trying to test drugs on them, and you're trying to record data on different phenotypes of the patient to see if it works or doesn't, and if there's side effects. So I actually think this particular field, I don't have to be such an expertise. I don't have to be an expert in the field of clinical science to understand it. I think that'd be quite different than someone that's in a very niche field, such as looking at chemoinformatics, where you need to understand very much like hydrophobic bonds, understand three-dimensional shapes and, how these things vibrate over time. That's very heavy expertise field where you need to be an expert in the subject matter. For me, I like the AI part a lot. So that part, while I do have to learn everything that comes out, I enjoy it a lot. So I'd say the hardest part for me is the actual server-side programming, writing in TensorFlow to create the API so someone on the front end can write it. So the most difficult part for me is keeping my Python skills up to date and knowing what the newest databases are. They're always coming out with updates to TensorFlow. TensorFlow 2 came out this year. PyTorch will change all the time. So for me, the hardest part is the programming.
Thank you so much, Mark. We really enjoyed your presentation and thought it was really interesting. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees here as well for joining us in this presentation.
Thank you. And everyone feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions or opportunities to work with Abby.
So real quick, actually, we will be giving Mark you a Discord link, and attendees, I think you are all also on that Discord. So Mark, if you would like to join, because there are some questions still in the bank. So you can go ahead and interact with our attendees on Discord. So if you would like, we'd be sending a link after this, and attendees, if you have those questions and you want them to be answered, please come on Discord. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thank you so much for Mark. I really enjoyed this talk. See you on Discord.
All right, thank you.